Hey, it's Silver, and this is Dead Estate. Now, part of the buzz surrounding this game when it first came out was due to the fact that the witch character Cordelia is stacked like pancakes at IHOP, and that is true, but underneath the smothering, voluptuous shadow is actually a really solid game. Dead Estate is a roguelite shooter that I initially missed out on when it first released. The main reason that I missed out on it really is because I really love this genre and I tend to cover a lot of them, but this is a variety gaming channel where I try to cover a lot of different things besides just RPGs and stuff that I'm the most interested in. I try to, mix it up a lot. And so this means that sometimes if I cover enough of a genre, I want to stop covering it for a while and look at other stuff to, keep the variety going. And the unfortunate side effect of that is that sometimes games that I was definitely interested in kind of slip through the cracks for a while, and I just miss out on covering them at the time. But in this case, I'm really very glad that I actually went back to take a look at this because it's a really solid game. In fact, I would say that it's really a must-play if you're into this genre, and if you're not into the genre, it might do enough things different to actually pull you in. Now, this game came out in October of 2021, quite close to Halloween, in fact, which definitely fits its overall themes, and it has received a lot of post-launch support since then. In fact, the developers have a specific no DLC policy that they have completely adhered to this whole time, and all of the updates have been completely free updates and no DLC, which is actually doubly impressive when you consider the fact that some of these updates are like nearly expansion size. Like, for instance, at the time of recording, the most recent update, the Bombs Away update, actually adds an entirely new character to play, like half a dozen weapons, a bunch of new room variants for extra challenge, and some entirely new room types. It adds a bunch of stuff, and this is pretty common with their updates. It seems they tend to be very substantial, and in fact the next coming update is going to be called Heaven and Hell, I believe, and it's supposed to come out sometime mid-February-ish, and it also sounds like it's going to include a whole bunch of content. No new characters, I believe, but a bunch of changes mechanically to the existing characters and some other stuff, so I'm looking forward to that. But I think that's just an impressive thing to point out because you don't always see this much love lavished onto a game post-launch, and I think it's definitely worth actually commending the devs for sticking with their no DLC policy and creating a whole bunch of very substantial content post-launch. As far as how the game plays, it'll be pretty familiar to you if you've played a roguelite before, with some unique differences. First off, you of course will select a character. Every character has a starting couple of stats, like an amount of maximum health and a movement speed, as well as a jump height and a starting weapon. And this game works a little bit differently than your traditional roguelite in that in most of them, if you consider stuff like Isaac or Gungeon or things like that, your starting weapon is very weak and is something that you want to replace or upgrade as quickly as possible. But in this game, that's definitely not the case, and in fact, your starting weapon is viable throughout the entire game. Even the later levels with the stronger, tougher enemies can still be dispatched with a good amount of skill and your starting weapon, which does have infinite ammo, and you can only hold one other weapon, by the way, so this is the kind of game where you're actually going to be mainlining your standard weapon for a lot of it, and the other weapon that you're holding is generally used for like elite enemies and boss fights and the like. You'll notice that the game itself has this really striking style to it. First off, it's in an isometric viewpoint, as in like truly, actually 2D isometric projection, which does take a little bit of getting used to at first with the movement and aiming and stuff, just because at first you'll find that some things are a little bit hard to run into or to avoid just because of the perspective that you get until you get used to exactly how it works. But it's not a detriment to the game or anything. In fact, I think it adds a lot to it because it gives it this sort of horror panorama vibe that I really enjoy. And in fact, the whole game itself reminds me a lot of Sweet Home on the NES, the OG survival horror, and in fact I think that isn't deliberate. The game also reminds me a lot of what Sweet Home spawned, i.e. Resident Evil, and that is very clearly on purpose because there are several direct Resident Evil references in this game that make it clear that the sort of survival horror vibe is what it's going for. And I think vibe is a good word for this game because its overall vibe and atmosphere is very strong, arguably its strongest point, because its art and music and sound effects and things are phenomenal, and they all pull together this sort of kitschy survival horror vibe that outlines the entire game. All of the sprite work is a lot of character to it. The actual main character sprites just have a ton of charm to them. I really love the way they look. And all of the other stuff, like the shop artwork and all that, the character portraits, they just look awesome. They have a lot of charm to them. And the really chunky voxel weapon models that you see in the top right are also really cute. They all have this sort of stubby, chibi look to them, but they're also oddly detailed for voxel models. So they have a really unique appearance to them that brings to mind, like, PS1 survival horror a little bit, and it helps to pull together this overall atmosphere that they're going for. So yeah, I definitely think that's probably the highest point of the game, is its atmosphere, the vibe that it gives off. It does a really good job of being this sort of throwback survival horror-like experience, but with its own personality. Another thing you'll immediately notice while playing is that the rooms you're in are all very small. All of the chambers that you actually go through are tiny, which means you've got this claustrophobic feel to the combat throughout the entire game. Even the boss rooms are very small. And this is something that takes a little bit of getting used to, and I think it's why they didn't opt to give you a dodge roll, as would be standard in a game like this. Instead, you have a jump. The jump does not give you immunity frames, but it does allow you to, jump over things, including enemies, although some enemies can also jump, by the way, so if you jump over them, they'll still hit you. You gotta be careful about how you use it, but it is an effective way to dodge stuff. And I'm pretty sure they did this specifically because of the very compact, claustrophobic nature of the rooms. A dodge roll from an isometric, cramped perspective like this maybe wouldn't make as much sense. So as you're exploring the various floors, you'll notice that each one very much has its own theme as well as its own complete set of enemies, very much like Isaac or Gungeon in that sense. You'll also notice one of the game's other mechanics, and that is chunks. As you're exploring the floor, eventually you'll hear this loud growl and the screen will shake, and then a few seconds later, this horrifying entity will spawn and chase you all around the floor. This is one of those games that gives you a certain time limit on each of the floors, after which it will spawn this creature to chase you around. And normally I don't really like this kind of mechanic in games, I'll be honest. I don't tend to like having a time limit on my exploration because I'm the kind of player that likes to explore every single nook and cranny and take my time, but in this case I actually think it adds to the game and I don't mind it, for a couple of reasons. One is that it adds to the survival horror aesthetic, right, because this character is obviously inspired by stuff like Mr. X and Nemesis, and he very much fulfills that same kind of role as this big scary thing that chases you around and keeps you moving along. But also, the time limit that he imposes is not an unreasonable one. You still have enough time to explore the floors, do some optional challenge rooms, go to shops, farm some money, stuff like that. It's not so strict, the time limit, that you have to only take the exclusively most efficient path or else. So I do appreciate that. And the other reason I don't mind him as much is that he's not an instant death wall that just chases you around and kills you immediately. He just does normal damage like a standard enemy, and in fact you can actually fight back against him and knock him out. If you get really good at memorizing his patterns, you can fight him and knock him out for that floor and give you as much time as you want. And the game actually rewards you for this because you get a ton of money for knocking him out every time you do it. And there are actually some players that will specifically wait around on floors just to spawn him and knock him out to get a bunch of cash. Now, money is actually very important in this game because you can spend it on several different things. Certain floors will have a sort of clinic that is ran usually by Cordelia, unless you're playing as Cordelia and then it's her mom, both of which have really charming artwork and voice acting. And this clinic sells stat boosts for increasing amounts of money, so you can up your maximum health, up your movement speed, and up your damage, as well as fully heal yourself. So this is a really good use for your money, obviously, because this persists throughout your entire run. So being able to upgrade your stats like this is very important. But you can also find a couple of other shops, like a actual witch's shop that sells the healing item as well as 3 different increasingly expensive artifacts that you could find. The expense is tied to their rarity, of course, and also a map of that current floor, and in fact there's an unlock tied to buying the map on every floor that gets you a new character. There's also a gun shop that allows you to buy some extra guns, but like I said, you can only hold one other gun aside from your primary infinite ammo weapon, so you do have to be a bit careful of what you're picking up. You can also hold the weapon switch button, which will destroy your alternate weapon for some money right now, which can be very useful, and is something that of course I always recommend doing before you pick up a new one, because you don't drop your weapon when you pick up a new one. It just disappears. So if you don't take the chance to destroy it for some quick cash, then you will miss out on that chance. Each floor has several different bosses that could potentially spawn, a la Isaac or Gungeon, and they tend to be really fun fights. They are quite quick. In fact, this whole game is very bite-sized, I would say. It's not a game that is small in terms of content. There's a ton of weapons, like 8 characters to play, a whole bunch of items to find, a bunch of alternate floors and stuff, so there's a lot to do, but each individual run is pretty bite-sized. For me, every successful run took about 20 to 25 minutes, and then I was done. But that is, of course, not getting the true ending, for one, and that's also, you could do that in a lot quicker if you were like a super good player. but that means the overall gameplay is pretty familiar. You know, you go around these levels, you get used to the different enemy types, now best to dispatch them, you search for new weapons, you search for new passive items that all synergize with each other to make yourself very strong, and you save up some money for whatever you might need from the various shops. As you complete the game multiple times, you will unlock things like new characters, you will unlock new alternate floors that have completely different tile sets, music, enemies, and bosses to face, as well as other challenges and unique items that you can find on these floors that all add up to eventually being able to unlock the true ending and some other stuff beyond that. So there's a lot of progression in this game, a lot of stuff to do beyond just doing run after run. There's a lot of sort of in between that you're expected to do in terms of finding new unlocks and getting new characters and stuff like that. Because of its isometric perspective, this game is best with a keyboard and mouse, but it does fully support a controller if you want to go that route, or if you have to go that route for like mobility reasons. It is still very playable with one, and in fact it works very well on the Steam Deck. It's actually a really fun time to play on the Steam Deck. This is one of those games that is fun to just keep installed, and then you'll occasionally find yourself just double-clicking it for a run or two when you have some extra time, because it's one of those games that is bite-sized enough to be quickly enjoyable, but deep enough to still keep your brain engaged. The movement feels very nice and fluid, which is important from like a fixed perspective like this. It needs to feel very responsive in order for it to actually feel right, and it does. It's very fluid movement. Your jump is actually quite fun to use, especially once you get some items that allow you like multiple jumps, or a boost jump that moves you along faster when you're in the air, and some other stuff like that. And of course, stomping items to hop on enemies' heads. And there's a lot of weapon variety. There's like 90 plus weapons and over 200 items to find, so there's plenty of build variety in terms of getting some crazy synergies going to make yourself super powerful. Also, the music is definitely something to mention. The music in this game is fantastic. It's really good stuff. It's got a mix between like fun, kind of chiptune-y, upbeat stuff that's just really nice while exploring, and some more creepy, atmospheric stuff later on. And honestly, you'll find that the deeper you get into the game, the more unsettling and creepy things get. A lot of the enemy sprites and stuff start out as kind of tragic but adorable, like the Binding of Isaac sprites, but as you get farther into the game, and especially reach stuff like the laboratory and things like that, it starts to get pretty creepy and unsettling, and that is exactly what I would expect from a game with the influences that this game has, right? It's clear, it's wearing its influences on its sleeve, it's obvious what kind of things have culminated in its creation. A lot of Resident Evil stuff, for instance, so you're going to be seeing a lot of that DNA throughout the personality of the game, and that's probably the best word to describe the game as a whole, is personality. The game has a ton of it, and that makes it a joy to play. Because of its smooth movement and high amount of run variety, its personality kind of cinches the deal to make it a unique and enjoyable roguelite. You then combine all of this charm and high variety gameplay with the large amount of post-release content that the developers have given it all for free, and you come up with a very cheap game that is super enjoyable, has a lot to do, and is very easy to recommend to anyone that likes this genre or might be thinking of trying a game in this genre. This is one of those games where you can tell a tremendous amount of love has been poured into it by the developers, and as cheesy as it often sounds, love is an extremely important ingredient in game development because you can tell when it's there. And you can also tell that the developers themselves have had a blast actually making this game because of how much charm and personality it has. That kind of enjoyment tends to bleed through in the finished product, and you see how much fun they've had actually creating it and continuing to add to it over time. This is sort of their baby, you can tell. You get that vibe from it. So that is Dead Estate. It is definitely something that is worth going back to, and is continuing to get impressive amounts of nearly expansion-sized content and free updates for everyone to enjoy. So I will link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page so that you can check it out yourself. Please do so if you enjoy stuff like this, and it's always worth supporting developers that love what they do this much. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.